"It is remarkable," said Dr. Manners, "how the scope of our pharmacopoeia has been widened by interplanetary exploration. In the past 30 years, hundreds of hitherto unknown substances, employable as drugs or medical agents, have been found in the other worlds of our own system. It will be interesting to see what the Alan Farquhar expedition will bring back from the planets of Alpha Centauri when, or if it succeeds in reaching them and returning to Earth. I doubt, though, if anything more valuable than selenine will be discovered. Selenine, derived from a fossil lichen found by the first rocket expedition to the Moon in 1975, has, as you know, practically wiped out the old-time curse of cancer. In solution, it forms the base of an infallible serum, equally useful for cure or prevention. I fear I haven't kept up on a lot of the new discoveries," said Rupert Balkuth the sculptor, Manners' guest, a little apologetically. "Of course everyone has heard of selenine, and I've seen frequent mention, recently, of a mineral water from Ganymede whose effects are like those of the mythical fountain of youth." "You mean Clythne, as the stuff is called by the Ganymedians. It is a clear, emerald liquid, rising in lofty geysers from the craters of quiescent volcanoes. Scientists believe that the drinking of Clythne is the secret of the almost fabulous longevity of the Ganymedians, and they think that it may prove to be a similar elixir for humanity. Some of the extraplanetary drugs haven't been so beneficial to mankind, have they?" queried Balkuth. "I seem to have heard of a Martian poison that has greatly facilitated the gentle art of murder, and I am told that Nafka, the Venerian narcotic, is far worse, in its effects on the human system, than is any terrestrial alkaloid." "Naturally," observed the doctor with philosophic calm, "many of these new chemical agents are capable of due abuse. They share that liability with any number of our native drugs. Man, as ever, has the choice of good and evil. I suppose that the Martian poison you speak of is akpololi, the juice of a common russet-yellow weed that grows in the oases of Mars. It is colorless, and without taste or odor. It kills almost instantly, leaving no trace, and imitating closely the symptoms of heart disease. Undoubtedly many people have been made away with by means of a surreptitious drop of akpololi in their food or medicine. But even akpololi, if used in infinitesimal doses, is a very powerful stimulant, useful in cases of syncope, and serving not infrequently to reanimate victims of paralysis in a quite miraculous manner. Of course," he went on, "there is an infinite lot still to be learned about many of these ultraterrene substances. Their virtues have often been discovered quite by accident, and in some cases the virtue is still to be discovered. For example, take Nafka, which you mentioned a little while ago. Though allied in a way to the earth narcotics such as opium and hashish, it is of little use for anesthetic or anodyne purposes. Its chief effects are an extraordinary acceleration of the time sense, and a heightening and telescoping of all sensations, whether pleasurable or painful. The user seems to be living and moving at a furious whirlwind rate, even though he may in reality be lying quiescent on a couch. He exists in a headlong torrent of sense impressions, and seems, in a few minutes, to undergo the experiences of years. The physical result is lamentable, a profound exhaustion, and an actual aging of the tissues, such as would ordinarily require the period of real time which the addict has lived through merely in his own illusion. There are some other drugs, comparatively little known, whose effects, if possible, are even more curious than those of Nafka. I don't suppose you have ever heard of plutonium?" "No, I haven't," admitted Balkuth. "Tell me about it. I can do even better than that. I can show you some of the stuff, though it isn't much to look at. Merely a fine white powder." Dr. Manners rose from the pneumatic cushioned chair in which he sat facing his guest, and went to a large cabinet of synthetic ebony, whose shelves were crowded with flasks, bottles, tubes, and cartons of various sizes and forms. Returning, he handed to Balkuth a squat and tiny vial, 2/3 filled with a starchy substance. "Plutonium," explained Manners, as its name would indicate, comes from Forlum, frozen Pluto, which only one terrestrial expedition has so far visited. The expedition led by the Cornell brothers, John and Augustine, which started in 1990 and did not return to Earth till 1996, when nearly everyone had given it up as lost. John, as you may have heard, died during the returning voyage, together with half the personnel of the expedition, and the others reached Earth with only one reserve oxygen tank remaining. This vial contains about a tenth of the existing supply of plutonium. Augustine Cornell, who is an old school friend of mine, gave it to me 3 years ago, just before he embarked with the Alan Farquhar crowd. I count myself pretty lucky to own anything so rare. The geologists of the party found the stuff when they began prying beneath the solidified gases that cover the surface of that dim, starlit planet, in an effort to learn a little about its composition and history. They couldn't do much under the circumstances with limited time and equipment, but they made some curious discoveries, of which plutonium was far from being the least. Like selenine, the stuff is a byproduct of vegetable fossilization. Doubtless it is many billion years old, and dates back to the time when Pluto possessed enough internal heat to make possible the development of certain rudimentary plant forms on its blind surface. It must have had an atmosphere then, though no evidence of former animal life was found by the Cornells. Plutonium, in addition to carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, and oxygen, contains minute quantities of several unclassified elements. It was discovered in a crystalloid condition, but turned immediately to the fine powder that you see, as soon as it was exposed to air in the rocket ship. It is readily soluble in water, forming a permanent colloid, without the least sign of deposit, no matter how long it remains in suspension. "You say it is a drug?" queried Balkith. "What does it do to you?" "I'll come to that in a minute, though the effect is pretty hard to describe. The properties of the stuff were discovered by chance. On the return journey from Pluto, a member of the expedition, half delirious with space fever, got hold of the unmarked jar containing it and took a small dose, imagining that it was bromide of potassium. It served to complicate his delirium for a while, since it gave him some brand new ideas about space and time. Other people have experimented with it since then. The effects are quite brief, the influence never lasts more than half an hour, and they vary considerably with the individual. There is no bad aftermath, either neural, mental, or physical, as far as anyone has been able to determine. I've taken it myself once or twice, and can testify to that. Just what it does to one, I am not sure. Perhaps it merely produces a derangement or metamorphosis of sensations, like hashish. Or perhaps it serves to stimulate some rudimentary organ, some dormant sense of the human brain. At any rate, there is, as clearly as I can put it, an altering of the perception of time, of actual duration, into a sort of space perception. One sees the past, and also the future, in relation to one's own physical self, like a landscape stretching away on either hand. You don't see very far, it is true, merely the events of a few hours in each direction. But it's a very curious experience, and it helps to give you a new slant on the mystery of time and space. It is altogether different from the delusions of Nafka. "It sounds very interesting," admitted Balkith. "However, I've never tampered much with narcotics myself, though I did experiment once or twice in my young, romantic days with cannabis indica. I had been reading Gaudiet and Baudelaire, I suppose. Anyway, the result was rather disappointing. You didn't take it long enough for your system to absorb a residuum of the drug, I imagine," said Manners. "Thus the effects were negligible from a visionary standpoint, but plutonium is altogether different. You get the maximum result from the very first dose. I think it would interest you greatly, Balkith, since you are a sculptor by profession. You would see some unusual plastic images, not easy to render in terms of Euclidean planes and angles. I'd gladly give you a pinch of it now, if you'd care to experiment. You're pretty generous, aren't you? Since the stuff is so rare?" "I'm not being generous at all. For years, I've planned to write a monograph on ultraterrestrial narcotics, and you might give me some valuable data. With your type of brain and your highly developed artistic sense, the visions of plutonium should be uncommonly clear and significant. All I ask is that you describe them to me as fully as you can afterwards." "Very well," agreed Balkith. "I'll try anything once." His curiosity was inveigled, his imagination seduced, by Manners' account of the remarkable drug. Manners brought out an antique whiskey glass, which he filled nearly to the rim with some golden red liquid. Uncorking the vial of plutonium, he added to this fluid a small pinch of the fine white powder, which dissolved immediately and without effervescence. "The liquid is a wine made from a sweet Martian tuber known as ovra," he explained. "It is light and harmless, and will counteract the bitter taste of the plutonium. Drink it quickly and then lean back in your chair. Balkith hesitated, eyeing the golden-red fluid. Are you quite sure the effects will wear off as promptly as you say? He questioned. It's 9:15 now, and I'll have to leave about 10 to keep an appointment with one of my patrons at the Belvedere Club. It's the billionaire, Claude Wishhaven, who wants me to do a bas-relief in pseudojade and neo-jasper for the hall of his country mansion. He wants something really advanced and futuristic. We're to talk it over tonight, decide on the motifs, etc. That gives you 45 minutes, assured the doctor. And in 30, at the most your brain and senses will be perfectly normal again. I've never known it to fail. You'll have 15 minutes to spare, in which to tell me all about your sensations. Balkith emptied the little antique glass at a gulp and leaned back, as Manners had directed, on the deep pneumatic cushions of the chair. He seemed to be falling easily but endlessly into a mist that had gathered in the room with unexplainable rapidity, and through this mist he was dimly aware that Manners had taken the empty glass from his relaxing fingers. He saw the face of Manners far above him, small and blurred, as if in some tremendous perspective of alpine distance, and the doctor's simple actions seemed to be occurring in another world. He continued to fall and float through eternal mist, in which all things were dissolved as in the primordial nebulae of chaos. After a timeless interval, the mist, which had been uniformly gray and hueless at first, took on a flowing iridescence, never the same for 2 successive moments. And the sense of gentle falling turned to a giddy revolution, as if he were caught in an ever-accelerating vortex. Coincidentally with his movement in this whirlpool of prismatic splendor, he seemed to undergo an indescribable mutation of the senses. The whirling colors, by subtle, ceaseless gradations, became recognizable as solid forms. Emerging, as if by an act of creation, from the infinite chaos, they appeared to take their place in an equally infinite vista. The feeling of movement, through decrescent spirals, was resolved into absolute immobility. Balkith was no longer conscious of himself as a living organic body. He was an abstract eye, a discorporate center of visual awareness, stationed alone in space, and yet having an intimate relationship with the frozen prospect on which he peered from his ineffable vantage. Without surprise, he found that he was gazing simultaneously in 2 directions. On either hand, for a vast distance that was wholly void of normal perspective, a weird and peculiar landscape stretched away, traversed by an unbroken frieze or bas-relief of human figures that ran like a straight, undeviating wall. For a while, the frieze was incomprehensible to Balkith. He could make nothing of its glacial, flowing outlines with their background of repeated masses and complicated angles and sections of other human friezes that approached or departed, often in a very abrupt manner, from an unseen world beyond. Then the vision seemed to resolve and clarify itself, and he began to understand. The bas-relief, he saw, was composed entirely of a repetition of his own figure, plainly distinct as the separate waves of a stream, and possessing a stream-like unity. Immediately before him, and for some distance on either hand, the figure was seated in a chair, the chair itself being subject to the same billowy repetition. The background was composed of the reduplicated figure of Dr. Manners, in another chair, and behind this, the manifold images of a medicine cabinet and a section of wall paneling. Following the vista on what, for lack of any better name, might be termed the left hand, Balkith saw himself in the act of draining the antique glass, with Manners standing before him. Then, still further, he saw himself previous to this, with a background in which Manners was presenting him the glass, was preparing the dose of plutonium, was going to the cabinet for the vial, was rising from his pneumatic chair. Every movement, every attitude of the doctor and himself during their past conversation, was visioned in a sort of reverse order, reaching away, unalterable as a wall of stone sculpture, into the weird, eternal landscape. There was no break in the continuity of his own figure, but Manners seemed to disappear at times, as if into a 4th dimension. These times, he remembered later, were the occasions when the doctor had not been in his line of vision. The perception was wholly visual, and though Balkith saw his own lips and those of Manners parted in movements of speech, he could hear no word or other sound. Perhaps the most singular feature of the vision was the utter absence of foreshortening. Though Balkith seemed to behold it all from a fixed, immovable point, The landscape and the intersecting frieze presented themselves to him without diminution, maintaining a frontal fullness and distinctness to a distance that might have been many miles. Continuing along the left-hand vista, he saw himself entering Manners' apartments, and then encountered his image standing in the elevator that had borne him to the 9th floor of the 100-story hotel in which Manners lived. Then the frieze appeared to have an open street for background, with a confused, ever-changing multitude of other faces and forms, of vehicles and sections of buildings, all jumbled together as in some old-time futuristic painting. Some of these details were full and clear, and others were cryptically broken and blurred so as to be scarcely recognizable. Everything, whatever its spatial position and relation, was rearranged in the flowing frozen stream of this temporal pattern. Balkith retraced the 3 blocks from Manners' hotel to his own studio, seeing all his past movements, whatever their direction in tridimensional space, as a straight line in the time dimension. At last he was in his studio, and there the frieze of his own figure receded into the eerie prospect of space-transmuted time among other friezes formed of actual sculptures. He beheld himself giving the final touches with his chisel to a symbolic statue at the afternoon's end, with a glare of ruddy sunset falling through an unseen window and flushing the pallid marble. Beyond this there was a reverse fading of the glow, a thickening and blurring of the half-chiseled features of the image, a female form to which he had given the tentative name of Oblivion. At length, among half-seen statuary, the left-hand vista became indistinct, and melted slowly in amorphous mist. He had seen his own life as a continuous glaciated stream, stretching for about 5 hours into the past. Reaching away on the right hand, he saw the vista of the future. Here there was a continuation of his seated figure under the influence of the drug, opposite the continued bas-relief of Dr. Manners and the repeated cabinet and wall panels. After a considerable interval, he beheld himself in the act of rising from the chair. Standing erect, he seemed to be talking a while, as in some silent antique film, to the listening doctor. After that, he was shaking hands with Manners, was leaving the apartment, was descending in the lift and following the open brightly lighted street toward the Belvedere Club where he was to keep his appointment with Claude Wishaven. The club was only 3 blocks away, on another street, and the shortest route after the first block was along a narrow alley between an office building and a warehouse. Balkith had meant to take this alley, and in his vision, he saw the bas-relief of his future figure passing along the straight pavement with a background of deserted doorways and dim walls that towered from sight against the extinguished stars. He seemed to be alone. There were no passers, only the silent, glimmering, endlessly repeated angles of arclit walls and windows that accompanied his repeated figure. He saw himself following the alley, like a stream in some profound canyon. And there midway, the strange vision came to an abrupt, inexplicable end, without the gradual blurring into formless mist that had marked his retrospective view of the past. The sculpture-like frieze with its architectural ground appeared to terminate, broken off clean and sharp, in a gulf of immeasurable blackness and nullity. The last wave-like duplication of his own person, the vague doorway beyond it, the glimmering alley pavement, all were seen as if shorn asunder by a falling sword of darkness, leaving a vertical line of cleavage beyond which there was nothing. Balkith had a feeling of utter detachment from himself, an elopement from the stream of time, from the shores of space, in some abstract dimension. The experience, in its full realization, might have lasted for an instant only, or for eternity. Without wonder, without curiosity or reflection, like a fourth-dimensional eye, he viewed simultaneously the unequal cross-sections of his own past and future. After that timeless interval of complete perception, there began a reverse process of change. He, the all-seeing eye, aloof in superspace, was aware of movement, as if he were drawn back by some subtle thread of magnetism into the dungeon of time and space from which he had momentarily departed. He seemed to be following the frieze of his own seated body toward the right, with a dimly felt rhythm or pulsation in his movement that corresponded to the merging duplications of the figure. With curious clearness, he realized that the time unit, by which these duplications were determined, was the beating of his own heart. Now, with accelerative swiftness, the vision of petrific form and space was redissolving into a spiral swirl of multitudinous colors, through which he was drawn upward. Presently he came to himself, seated in the pneumatic chair with Dr. Manners opposite. The room seemed to waver a little, as if with some lingering touch of the weird transmutation, and webs of spinning iris hung in the corners of his eyes. Apart from this, the effect of the drug had wholly vanished, leaving, however, a singularly clear and vivid memory of the almost ineffable experience. Dr. Manners began to question him at once, and Balketh described his visionary sensations as fully and graphically as he could. "There is one thing I don't understand," said Manners at the end with a puzzled frown. "According to your account, you must have seen 5 or 6 hours of the past, running in a straight spatial line, as a sort of continuous landscape. But the vista of the future ended sharply after you had followed it for 3/4 of an hour, or less. I've never known the drug to act so unequally. The past and future perspectives have always been about the same in their extent for others who have used plutonium." "Well," observed Balketh, "the real marvel is that I could see into the future at all. In a way, I can understand the vision of the past. It was clearly composed of physical memories of all my recent movements, and the background was formed of all the impressions my optic nerves had received during that time. But how could I behold something that hasn't yet happened?" "There's the mystery, of course," assented Manners. "I can think of only one explanation at all intelligible to our finite minds. This is that all the events which compose the stream of time have already happened, are happening, and will continue to happen forever. In our ordinary state of consciousness, we perceive with the physical senses merely that moment which we call the present. Under the influence of plutonium, you are able to extend the moment of present cognition in both directions, and to behold simultaneously a portion of that which is normally beyond perception. Thus appeared the vision of yourself as a continuous, immobile body, extending through the time vista." Balketh, who had been standing, now took his leave. "I must be going," he said, "or I'll be late for my appointment." "I won't detain you any longer," said Manners. He appeared to hesitate and then added, "I'm still at a loss to comprehend the abrupt cleavage and termination of your prospect of the future. The alley in which it seemed to end was Falmouth Alley, I suppose your shortest route to the Belvedere Club. If I were you, Balketh, I'd take another route, even if it requires a few minutes extra." "That sounds rather sinister," laughed Balketh. "Do you think that something may happen to me in Falmouth Alley? I hope not, but I can't guarantee that it won't." Manners' tone was oddly dry and severe. "You'd better do as I suggest." Balketh felt the touch of a momentary shadow as he left the hotel, a premonition brief and light as the passing of some night bird on noiseless wings. What could it mean, that gulf of infinite blackness into which the weird frieze of his future had appeared to plunge, like a frozen cataract? Was there a menace of some sort that awaited him in a particular place, at a particular moment? He had a curious feeling of repetition, of doing something that he had done before, as he followed the street. Reaching the entrance of Falmouth Alley, he took out his watch. By walking briskly and following the alley, he would reach the Belvedere Club punctually. But if he went on around the next block, he would be a little late. Balketh knew that his prospective patron, Claude Wishhaven, was almost a martinet in demanding punctuality from himself and from others, so he took the alley. The place appeared to be entirely deserted, as in his vision. Midway, Balketh approached the half-seen door, a rear entrance of the huge warehouse, which had formed the termination of the time prospect. The door was his last visual impression, for something descended on his head at that moment, and his consciousness was blotted out by the supervening night he had previsioned. He had been sandbagged very quietly and efficiently by a 21st century thug. The blow was fatal, and time, as far as Balketh was concerned, had come to an end.